At 8:43 in the morning on September 2nd, 1943, Technical Sergeant James McKenna stood on the tarmac at Dobodura Airfield in New Guinea, watching Lieutenant Robert Hayes taxi a P-38 Lightning toward the runway. McKenna's hands were still greasy from the modification he had just finished installing on that aircraft. A modification that violated every regulation in the Army Air Force Maintenance Manual. A modification that could get him court-martialed if anyone found out. But McKenna wasn't thinking about regulations right now. He was thinking about the 17 pilots he had watched die in the past 6 weeks. Good men, kids, really. Most of them barely old enough to buy a beer back home, climbing into their P-38 seconds with confidence and coming back in boxes or not coming back at all. Hayes was number 18 on that list if nothing changed. The kid from Iowa, 23 years old, farm boy with freckles and a nervous smile, 6 combat missions under his belt, and 0 kills. Not because Hayes was a bad pilot. No, Hayes followed the rules, and the rules were getting American pilots killed every single day. The intelligence report that morning said 18 Mitsubishi A-6M0 fighters were inbound. The 5th Air Force was sending up 12 P-38 seconds to intercept. Those weren't good odds. The 0 was lighter, more agile, could turn inside a P-38 every single time. American doctrine was clear about this. Never turn with a 0. Never try to outmaneuver them. Use your speed, use your altitude. Dive in, shoot, climb out, hit and run. Don't get caught in a turning fight, because if you do, you die. The problem was that combat doesn't follow doctrine. The Zeros were smart. Their pilots had been fighting since Pearl Harbor. They knew how to bait American pilots into turns, how to cut inside their turning radius, how to get on their tail and pump them full of 20mm cannon shells. In the past 6 weeks alone, the 5th Air Force had lost 37 P-38 Lightnings over New Guinea, most of them shot down after being caught in turning engagements they couldn't escape. McKenna had signed off on every single one of those aircraft before their final flights. He had checked their engines, verified their ammunition loads, tested their control surfaces, everything by the book, everything within specifications. And those pilots had died anyway, because the book was wrong. Look, before we go any further, I want to ask you something. If you're the kind of person who appreciates stories about the guys who didn't wait for permission to save lives, the mechanics and engineers who saw a problem and fixed it even when the brass said it couldn't be done, then hit that subscribe button right now, because that is exactly what this story is about. One sergeant, one simple modification, changing the outcome of the air war in the Pacific. And I promise you, by the end of this, you will understand why sometimes the best solutions come from the guys getting their hands dirty on the flight line, not the ones sitting behind desks 7,000 miles away in California. Now, let's get back to McKenna and that modification he just installed on Hayes' aircraft. The P-38 Lightning was a beast of a fighter. Twin engine, twin boom design, fast in a straight line, absolute monster at high altitude. But it had one fatal problem that Lockheed's engineers either didn't know about or didn't care to fix. The P-38 could not turn with a 0, and the reason why was something most pilots never even thought about. It was not about horsepower or wing loading or any of that aerodynamic theory they taught in flight school. It was about cables. See, the P-38's aileron control cables ran from the cockpit through the twin booms all the way back to the tail section, then forward through a series of pulleys to the wing control surfaces. It was a long run, lots of cable, lots of pulleys, lots of places where things could go slightly wrong. And in the P-38, things did go slightly wrong. The cable system had slack. Not much, maybe 3/8 of an inch at full deflection. Factory tolerances allowed for it. Lockheed said it was within spec. The engineering manuals said it was acceptable. But that tiny bit of slack created a delay between when a pilot moved his control stick and when the ailerons actually responded. At high speeds, during dive attacks and straight-line runs, it didn't matter. The aircraft was moving fast enough that a fraction of a second delay was negligible. But at low speeds during hard-turning maneuvers, when you are trying to roll into a defensive break or reverse direction to avoid getting shot, that fraction of a second was the difference between rolling inside a zero's turn and getting your tail shot off. McKenna had been maintaining P-38 seconds for 8 months. He knew these aircraft inside and out. He had worked on Allison engines in civilian life, spent years as a mechanic in Long Beach. Before the war, he understood how mechanical systems were supposed to work, and he knew when something was not right. Before the war, McKenna had been one of those guys who could diagnose an engine problem just by listening to it run. He had started working in his father's garage when he was 12 years old, learning the trade from the ground up. By the time he was 18, he could rebuild a complete engine blindfolded. His specialty was precision work, the kind of fine adjustments that most mechanics didn't have the patience for. Valve timing, carburetor synchronization, control linkages, the details that separated a good engine from a great one. That attention to detail served him well in the Army Air Force, but it also made him see problems that others missed. The first time he really noticed the control cable issue was after Lieutenant David Chen got shot up over Leh in July. Chen was a good pilot, smart, careful, followed procedures. He had been in theater for 3 weeks, still learning the aircraft, still building his combat experience. On July 9th, Chen took off on a fighter sweep at 06:15. He came back 2 hours later with 3 bullet holes in his left boom and a story that made McKenna's blood run cold. Chen said he had gotten into a turning fight with a Zero. The Japanese pilot had reversed on him, and Chen tried to roll out and dive away like the manual said, but the airplane felt slow to respond. Chen said it was like there was a delay between when he moved the stick and when the aircraft actually rolled, just a split second. But that split second was enough for the Zero to get inside his turn and line up a perfect deflection shot. The only reason Chen survived was because his wingman shot the Zero off his tail. McKenna looked at those bullet holes. They were in a tight group, spaced maybe 6 inches apart. Perfect shooting. The Zero pilot had led Chen exactly right, had anticipated exactly where Chen's airplane would be a half second in the future. That should not have been possible if Chen had rolled hard and dove immediately. Unless the airplane had delayed just long enough for the Zero to get the lead correct, Chen did not fly again. His aircraft went back to the depot for repairs. McKenna never saw him after that. 3 weeks later, he heard Chen had been killed flying a different P-38 over Rabaul. Same story, caught in a turning fight, could not roll out fast enough. McKenna wondered if Chen's new aircraft had the same control cable slack. He was pretty sure it did. The second pilot McKenna lost was Captain William Morrison. Now, Morrison was not some green kid fresh out of flight school. Morrison was a flight leader, experienced, 11 kills to his name. He knew the P-38 inside and out, knew its limitations, flew smart, flew cautious, never took unnecessary risks. On August 3rd, Morrison's flight intercepted 8 Zeros at 12,000 feet over Oro Bay. Morrison got 1 Zero on the first pass, came around for another run. 2 Zeros reversed on him. McKenna heard the radio traffic afterward from the guys who made it back. Morrison tried to roll inverted and split S away. Standard defensive maneuver. But Morrison called out over the radio that his controls felt mushy, like they weren't responding right. The Zeros stayed with him through the maneuver, shot him down at 4,000 feet. Morrison's wingman said it looked like Morrison's airplane was not responding fast enough, like Morrison was fighting the controls, trying to force the aircraft to do what he wanted, but the machine wasn't cooperating. Morrison died in the crash. His crew chief was a friend of McKenna's, a guy named Rodriguez from Texas. Rodriguez was convinced there was something wrong with Morrison's aircraft. After they recovered the wreckage, Rodriguez checked everything. Engine settings, magneto timing, control surface rigging, cable tensions. Everything was within spec. Nothing mechanically wrong with the airplane. The official report said pilot error, said Morrison had misjudged his altitude during the split S maneuver and crashed into the ground. Rodriguez did not believe it. Neither did McKenna. They had both known Morrison. The man was too experienced, too careful to make that kind of mistake, unless his aircraft had betrayed him at the critical moment. Unless that fraction of a second delay in the control response had thrown off his timing just enough to turn a survivable maneuver into a fatal one. By mid-August, McKenna had watched 17 pilots die. Some he knew well. Most he had only met briefly while doing pre-flight checks. But he had worked on all their aircraft, had signed off their maintenance logs, had watched them taxi out, watched them take off. Some came back, some did not. The ones who came back told the same story over and over. The P-38 felt slow to respond in hard maneuvering, like there was a slight lag between control input and aircraft reaction. Most pilots thought that was just how the airplane handled. Heavy fighter, big control surfaces, some delay was expected. The flight instructors back in the States had told them the P-38 was not a dogfighter. It was a boom and zoom fighter. Hit fast, hit hard, get out. Don't try to turn with the enemy. But McKenna knew that was not the whole truth. The P-38 was not responding slowly because it was heavy. It was responding slowly because the control cables had slack in them, and that slack was killing pilots. So McKenna did something about it. He started paying attention to the sound the cables made when he tensioned them during maintenance. There was a specific tone, a sort of low twang, when you plucked them with your finger. Loose cables sounded different than tight cables. The frequency was lower, the vibration dampened. McKenna could hear the difference. Every P-38 on the line had cables that sounded slightly loose. Within spec, sure, factory acceptable, but loose. One evening, after Morrison died, McKenna mentioned this to Rodriguez. They were sitting in the mess tent, eating something that was supposed to be beef stew, but tasted like cardboard. Rodriguez asked what could be done about the cable tension. McKenna said nothing official. Officially, no field mechanic had authorization to modify flight control systems. That required engineering approval from Lockheed. And Lockheed was 7,000 miles away in California, sitting in comfortable offices, designing aircraft for theoretical combat conditions that did not exist in the real world. The engineering officer at Dobodura had already told McKenna the cable tension was within specifications. Factory tolerances allowed for that slack. Changing it would void the aircraft warranty. Besides, the officer said, if there was really a problem, Lockheed would have fixed it by now. The P-38 had been in service for over a year. Surely the smart engineers in California would have noticed if something was wrong. But those engineers were not watching pilots die. McKenna was. But unofficially, McKenna said there was a solution. It just required braking regulations that could get them both court-martialed. The problem was not that American pilots did not know what to do. They knew. Every briefing emphasized it. Every training flight drilled it into their heads. Never turn with a zero. Use speed. Use altitude. Hit and run. The doctrine was crystal clear. The problem was that combat did not follow doctrine. Lieutenant Robert Hayes had been in New Guinea for 2 months. 23 years old, farm kid from Iowa who had probably never been more than 100 miles from home before the war. He had grown up working his family's farm, fixing tractors and combines, learning how to solve problems with limited resources. That farm kid resourcefulness should have served him well in combat. But it didn't matter how resourceful you were if your airplane wouldn't do what you needed it to do. Hayes had flown 6 combat missions and had 0 kills. Not because he was a bad pilot. Hayes was actually pretty good, but he followed the rules, and the rules kept putting him in positions where he could not get a shot. The rules said, dive from altitude, use your speed advantage, don't turn, but the Zeros didn't follow those rules. They reversed, they climbed, they forced American pilots into situations where the doctrine didn't work. On his 3rd mission, Hayes dove on a 0 from altitude, built up speed to 400 miles per hour, came in from the sun like the manual said, got the 0 in his gun sight, started to pull lead for deflection. The 0 snap-rolled left and dove. Hayes tried to follow. His P-38 rolled into the turn, but it felt like the aircraft was moving through mud. By the time his nose pointed where he wanted it, the Zero was gone. Hayes pulled out, climbed back to altitude. No shots fired, no kill, just another mission where he had done everything right and gotten nothing for it. Fourth mission was worse. Hayes and his wingman jumped 2 zeros at 15,000 feet. Perfect setup, altitude advantage, sun position correct. Hayes got the first burst off, missed high. The Zero reversed hard right. Hayes rolled to follow, trying to get guns on target. His wingman called out 2 more Zeros coming in from above. Hayes tried to roll back level and dive away, use his speed to escape. The airplane responded, but slowly, just slowly enough that one of the diving Zeros got a 3-second burst into Hayes's right boom, 20mm cannon shells. They did not penetrate the engine, but they scared Hayes badly enough that he broke off the engagement and ran for home with his engine smoking and his hands shaking on the control stick. Fifth mission. Hayes watched his wingman die. The wingman's name was Lieutenant Thomas Parker, 21 years old, from Boston. They had gone through training together at Luke Field in Arizona, shipped out together, on the same transport ship, bunked next to each other in the same tent at Dobodura. Parker was one of those guys who should have lived forever. Always smiling, always optimistic, wrote letters to his mother every single day without fail. On August 14th, Parker got separated from the formation during a dogfight over Finchhafen. 2 Zeros got on his tail. Parker tried everything. Rolled hard, reversed, tried to scissor back and forth to force an overshoot. The Zeros stayed with him through every maneuver. Hayes heard Parker on the radio calling for help. Heard the panic in his voice. Heard Parker say his airplane was not turning fast enough. Heard him say the controls felt sluggish. Heard the gunfire over the radio. Heard Parker scream. Then nothing. Just static. Hayes did not sleep that night. Neither did most of the squadron. Parker's bed stayed empty. His personal effects got packed up and shipped home to his mother in Boston. His P-38 was written off as a combat loss. The maintenance log noted no mechanical issues. The official cause of death was pilot error during defensive maneuvering. McKenna had worked on Parker's aircraft the morning he died. Everything was perfect. Engine timing, magnetosynchronization, control surface alignment, cable tension within spec. The airplane was mechanically sound by every official measure, but Parker was dead anyway. And McKenna knew why. That fraction of a second delay in the controls, that tiny bit of slack that the manual said was acceptable. It had killed Parker, just like it had killed Morrison and Chen and 14 others. The worst part for McKenna was not the danger. It was not the long hours, or the tropical heat, or the insects that got into everything, or the knowledge that Japanese bombers could hit the airfield any night. The worst part was the smell. Every morning, McKenna worked in the maintenance area, and the smell of aviation fuel and hot metal and hydraulic fluid filled his nose. It was the smell of aircraft preparing for combat. Some of those aircraft would come back, some would not. And McKenna would be there the next morning, smelling the same smells, working on more aircraft, watching more pilots walk out to machines that could not respond fast enough to keep them alive. And every morning, McKenna would sign off on those aircraft, would certify that they were airworthy, that they met all specifications, that they were ready for combat. He would watch young pilots climb into cockpits, watch them taxi to the runway, watch them take off into the tropical sky, and he would wonder which ones would come back. On the evening of August 16th, Hayes came to the maintenance area, found McKenna working on his assigned P-38, checking the engine oil levels. Hayes asked if there was anything McKenna could do to make the airplane roll faster. Anything at all. Hayes said he didn't care if it was regulation or not. He just wanted a chance to survive his next mission. He said he could feel the delay in the controls, could feel the airplane not responding the way it should. He said he didn't want to die like Parker had died, listening to his own voice on the radio, calling for help that wouldn't come in time. McKenna looked at Hayes, saw the fear in his eyes, saw the desperation, saw a 23-year-old kid who knew he was going to die if something did not change. saw himself in Hayes, that same feeling of helplessness, watching a problem kill people and not being able to do anything about it through official channels. McKenna told Hayes to come back in the morning. He would see what he could do. Now, here is where I want to pause for a second and talk about something important, because what McKenna did next was not heroic in the traditional sense. He did not charge a machine gun nest or fly into enemy fire or do any of the things we usually think about when we picture World War II heroes. What McKenna did was simple. He saw a problem that was killing his friends, and he fixed it. He did not wait for permission, he did not fill out paperwork, or go through channels, or wait for someone with more authority to make a decision. He just fixed the problem. And if you appreciate stories about people who take action, instead of waiting for someone else to solve their problems, hit that like button right now. Because that kind of initiative, that kind of personal responsibility, that is what won the war, not just in the air, but everywhere. Ordinary guys seeing problems and fixing them without waiting to be told what to do. McKenna worked alone that night. The maintenance hangar was quiet after 2,300 hours. Most of the crew had gone to sleep, exhausted from another day of 14-hour shifts in the tropical heat. The only sounds were the distant rumble of generators powering the base and the buzz of insects against the overhead lights. The air smelled like engine oil and tropical humidity, thick and heavy, the kind of air that made it hard to breathe even when you were not doing anything. McKenna pulled the inspection panel off Hayes's P-38 left boom. The metal was still warm from the day's sun, radiating heat even hours after sunset. Inside, the aileron control cable ran through a series of pulleys toward the tail section. McKenna grabbed the cable with both hands and pulled, feeling for that slack. There it was, maybe 3/8 of an inch of play before the tension caught and the cable went taut. His hands were covered in grease, and his fingers ached from a full day of maintenance work. But he could feel that slack clearly. It was wrong. He knew it was wrong. He had known it for weeks. The piano wire came from a salvaged P-38 that had ground-looped 2 weeks earlier during landing. The pilot had survived, but the aircraft was scrap metal, too damaged to repair economically. It was destined for the depot, where it would be cut up for spare parts, but McKenna had pulled useful components before it got hauled away, including a 6-inch piece of high-tensile piano wire from the rudder trim system. He had kept it in his tool bag without really knowing why. Now he knew. Sometimes you hold on to things because some part of your brain knows you will need them later. He sat on the hangar floor with the wire and a pair of pliers, bent it into a Z shape, carefully, precisely. The wire was stiff, high-carbon steel, fought back against the pliers. His hand slipped twice on the greasy metal, cut his thumb on the second try, a clean slice that bled more than it should have. The blood made the wire slippery. He wiped it on his coveralls and kept working, ignoring the pain. Took him 8 minutes to get the bend exactly right, the angles precise, the length perfect for what he needed. The Z shape would act as an inline tensioner, would add just enough preload to the cable to eliminate the slack completely without overstressing the system. Installing it was harder than making it. The space inside the boom was tight, claustrophobic. McKenna had to work with one hand while holding a flashlight with the other. The beam kept moving as his hand got tired. Shadows jumped across the cable system, making it hard to see what he was doing. His shoulder was wedged against the boom structure, the sharp metal edge cutting into his arm through his coveralls. He could feel sweat running down his back, despite the night air being relatively cool compared to the daytime heat. He disconnected the cable at the pulley junction. His fingers, stiff from a day of hard work, fumbled with the clevis pin that held the cable to the pulley, dropped it, heard it bounce somewhere inside the boom, that distinctive metallic ping. Spent 5 minutes feeling around in the dark with his fingers until he found it wedged against a structural rib. The whole time, his heart was pounding. Not from the physical effort, but from the knowledge of what he was doing. If the engineering officer found him doing unauthorized modifications to a flight control system, he would face a court-martial. The charges would be serious. Sabotage, potentially. Unauthorized modification of military equipment. Endangering an aircraft. Endangering a pilot. The penalties could range from dishonorable discharge to prison time. In a war zone, they could shoot you for less. But Hayes was going to die if McKenna did not do something. Parker had died. Chen had died. Morrison had died. 17 pilots in 6 weeks. And McKenna knew why. He knew what the problem was. And he had the skills to fix it. So he was going to fix it. Consequences be damned. He inserted the piano wire tensioner between the cable end and the pulley, reconnected the cable. The fit was tight, tighter than he expected. He had to force the clevis pin through the holes, using a punch and a small hammer to drive it through. When it finally seated with a satisfying click, he tested the tension by hand, pulled on the cable, feeling the resistance. No slack. Perfect. The control surface moved immediately with his input. Instantaneous response. This was how it should have been from the factory. McKenna replaced the inspection panel, tightening each screw carefully, cleaned up his tools, putting everything back in his tool bag, wiped the blood off the wire in his hands with a rag, wrapping his thumb in a strip of cloth torn from an old shirt, walked out of the hangar at 01:15 in the morning, his legs stiff from sitting on the concrete floor for so long. The tropical night was humid and still. The kind of stillness that feels heavy, oppressive. Somewhere in the distance, he heard aircraft engines, Japanese night raiders, probably looking for targets. The sound made his stomach clench, that instinctive fear response. He stood there for a moment, listening, trying to determine if the sound was getting closer. It faded into the distance. Not tonight. He had just modified a flight control system without authorization, used a non-standard part, violated at least a dozen regulations. If the modification failed during flight, if that piano wire broke or slipped or caused some unforeseen problem, Hayes would crash, and McKenna would be responsible for killing him. But if it worked, Hayes might live, might actually have a fair fight against the Zeros, instead of being handicapped by an aircraft that couldn't respond fast enough. McKenna went to his bunk, did not sleep, just lay there in the darkness, watching the ceiling, listening to the sounds of the jungle outside, the insects and the distant thunder and the occasional sound of aircraft, thinking about what he had done, wondering if it would work, wondering if he had just saved Hayes's life or signed his own death warrant. Dawn broke over the jungle with that sudden tropical brightness, darkness to full daylight in what felt like minutes. At 06:30, McKenna walked to the flight line. His eyes burned from lack of sleep. His thumb throbbed where he had cut it. But he had to be there, had to watch the ground crew fuel and arm Hayes's aircraft, loading the .50 caliber ammunition and the 20mm cannon shells. Watched Hayes walk out for his pre-flight briefing with the other pilots. Watched him climb into the cockpit at 07:35, strapping in, checking his instruments, going through the pre-flight checklist. At 07:42, Hayes took off. The twin Allison engines roared as the P-38 accelerated down the runway, lifted off, climbed into the morning sky. McKenna stood on the flight line and watched until the aircraft was just a speck in the distance, watched it join formation with 11 other aircraft, watched them head northwest toward Japanese airspace. And then all McKenna could do was wait and pray that his modification worked, that it didn't fail, that Hayes would come back alive. The engagement started at 08:14, about 30 minutes after takeoff. Hayes's flight of 4 P-38 seconds intercepted 9 zeros at 13,000 feet over Huon Gulf. The morning sun was behind the Americans, low on the horizon, giving them the crucial advantage of attacking from out of the sun where the Japanese pilots would be blinded. Perfect setup for a diving attack. Hayes was flying number 3 position, wingman to the element leader. His element leader called out the bounce over the radio. They rolled in, noses down, building speed. Hayes picked a 0 at the back of the formation, the trailing aircraft, always the most vulnerable target. Dove from altitude, building speed rapidly, 300 miles per hour, 320, 350. The P-38 accelerated like a brick in free fall, those twin Allison engines pushing 1,500 horsepower each, 380 miles per hour. The 0 grew larger in his gun sight. Hayes could see every detail now, the painted rising sun on the fuselage, the pilot's head in the canopy, the wing struts. He pressed the trigger. 4 50 caliber machine guns in the nose and one 20mm cannon between them hammered. The recoil shook the aircraft. Tracers reached out across the sky, bright orange lines converging on the target. Most missed, passing just above or below the Zero. A few hits sparked off the Zero's wing, metal on metal. Not enough damage. Not a killing shot. The Zero snap-rolled right and dove. Exactly the maneuver Hayes had seen a dozen times before. Standard Japanese defensive tactic. Roll and dive to break the attack, force the American to either follow or break off. Hayes rolled to follow. Without thinking, pure instinct. And that is when he felt it. The airplane responded instantly. No delay, no lag, no sense of fighting the controls. The stick moved, and the aircraft rolled immediately, aggressively, like it had been waiting for the command. Hayes had never felt his P-38 move like that before. It was like the airplane had been waiting for his command and executed it the moment he gave it, like there was a direct connection between his brain and the control surfaces. He rolled 90 degrees in what felt like half the normal time, impossibly fast for a P-38. Got his nose down, pointing at the diving Zero. The Zero was right there in his sight picture, filling the gun sight reticle. He fired again. 3-second burst, a long burst by fighter standards. The rounds walked up the Zero's fuselage from tail to cockpit, punching holes in the thin aluminum skin. The Zero's engine exploded in a fireball of orange flame and black smoke. Pieces flew off, wing panels and cowling fragments tumbling through the sky. The aircraft rolled inverted and fell toward the jungle below, trailing smoke like a banner. Hayes's first kill. Finally, after 6 missions of frustration, of following doctrine and getting nothing, he had a kill. But there was no time to celebrate, no time to feel satisfaction. His wingman called out over the radio. "Zeros, diving from above. 3 of them, coming fast." Hayes looked up through the canopy, craning his neck, saw 3 of them coming down in a shallow dive, coming fast, maybe 4 seconds from gun range. They had seen him shoot down their friend. Now they wanted revenge. Japanese pilots took that seriously. You kill one of theirs, they come after you hard. Hayes shoved the throttles forward to the stops, felt the engines surge, started to climb. But the Zeros were faster in the dive, had gravity and momentum on their side. They would be on him in seconds. His only option was to reverse and fight. Fight 3-on-1. Every instinct screamed at him to keep climbing, keep running, use his speed advantage, run for home. That was the doctrine. Never get into a turning fight with multiple opponents. But doctrine meant dying today. If he ran, they would chase him down, get on his tail, shoot him down just like they had shot down Parker. Hayes rolled hard left and pulled back on the stick, hauling the nose. Up. The P-38 snapped around like nothing he had ever experienced, like a completely different aircraft. The nose came through the horizon instantly. No delay, no mush, just instant response. He saw the lead Zero. It was turning to follow him, but the Japanese pilot had not expected Hayes to reverse that fast. The Zero pilot had anticipated a longer roll time, had positioned for where Hayes should have been, but Hayes was already there. Inside the turn, guns on target, the Zero was in a bad position. Exposed. Vulnerable. Hayes pulled lead, estimating deflection. Fired. Hit the Zero in the left wing root, right where the wing joined the fuselage. The structural spar failed. The wing folded upward like it was hinged. The Zero tumbled out of the sky, out of control. 2 kills in 30 seconds. Impossible. This was not how P-38 combat worked. P-38 seconds did not dogfight, but Hayes was doing it anyway. The other 2 Zeros tried to scissor with him, alternating turns to force an overshoot. Standard Japanese tactic against heavier American fighters. Turn one way, force the American to follow, then reverse hard the other way. The American fighter, heavier and slower to respond, overshoots. The Zero gets behind him, game over. But Hayes stayed with them. Every time they reversed direction, His P-38 snapped into the turn instantly. No delay. No fighting the controls. No overshoot. The airplane did exactly what he wanted the moment he wanted it. It was like flying a different aircraft. Like someone had removed invisible weights from the control system. 1-0 made a mistake. Reversed too hard, too aggressive, bled too much speed. Lost energy. Hayes got inside his turn, cutting across the circle. Close range, maybe 200 feet. Point blank for aerial combat. He fired. Could not miss at that distance. The Zero came apart under the concentrated fire. Pieces of aircraft fell past Hayes's canopy. Aluminum skin and structural members tumbling. He felt his P-38 shudder as debris hit his right boom, a metallic bang that echoed through the airframe. 3 kills. 3 confirmed kills in one engagement. More than Hayes had gotten in his entire combat career up to that point. The 4th Zero ran, just turned and dove away at full throttle, running for home. Hayes did not chase. He was low on fuel and ammunition. The gauges showed his tanks were down to reserves, maybe 20 minutes of flight time left. He climbed back to altitude, reformed with what was left of his flight. 2 of the 4 P-38 seconds were gone, shot down, or separated. They headed home, nursing damaged aircraft back to Dobodura. The entire engagement lasted 7 minutes. 7 minutes that changed everything. When Hayes landed at Dobodura at 09:03, McKenna was waiting on the flight line. He had been standing there for the entire hour, waiting, watching the sky, praying. Hayes shut down the engines, the props winding down with that distinctive decreasing whine, climbed out of the cockpit, his flight suit soaked with sweat, dark stains under his arms and down his back. His hands were shaking, adrenaline dump after combat. His legs were unsteady as he climbed down from the wing. He walked straight to McKenna, bypassing the debrief crew, ignoring the intelligence officer who wanted to talk to him. Hayes said 2 words. It worked. McKenna felt something release in his chest, tension he had been holding for hours. Hayes was alive. The modification had worked. It had not failed. It had done exactly what McKenna hoped it would do. What neither of them realized was that 6 other pilots had watched Hayes's engagement from altitude. Captain Frank Mitchell saw the entire fight from 15,000 feet, orbiting above the furball, maintaining altitude advantage in case more Japanese fighters showed up. Mitchell was a flight leader in the 475 fighter group, one of the most experienced pilots in theater. He had been watching Hayes's element engage the Zeros below when he noticed something unusual, something that did not fit his understanding of how P-38 seconds moved. Hayes's P-38 was rolling faster than any Lightning Mitchell had ever seen. The aircraft snapped through maneuvers like it weighed half what it should, like it had the roll rate of a much lighter fighter. Mitchell knew every pilot in the theater, had flown with most of them at some point, knew their skill levels, their tendencies, their capabilities. Hayes was good, competent, but not exceptional, not good enough to out-dogfight 3 Zeros and come out alive. Something was different about his airplane. Something had changed. After landing, Mitchell found Hayes in the debriefing room. Hayes was still amped up on adrenaline, hands shaking as he filled out the combat report, trying to write legibly, but the pen kept jumping across the paper. 3 confirmed kills in a single engagement. His first kills after 6 missions of nothing. Mitchell asked him directly what was different today, what had changed. Hayes said he did not know for sure, but his airplane just responded better, faster, more immediate, like the delay he had been feeling in previous missions was gone. Mitchell asked if maintenance had done anything to the aircraft, any modifications or adjustments. Hayes said Mitchell should talk to Technical Sergeant McKenna. He would explain. Mitchell found McKenna in the maintenance area 2 hours later. McKenna was working on a different P-38, replacing a damaged hydraulic line, his hands black with grease and hydraulic fluid. His coveralls were stained with oil and sweat. Mitchell asked him directly, no preamble, "What did you do to Hayes's airplane?" McKenna looked at Mitchell for a long moment, weighing his options. He could lie, say he didn't know what Mitchell was talking about, or he could tell the truth and face whatever consequences came from that. McKenna chose truth. He told Mitchell everything. The piano wire tensioner, the cable, modification, the unauthorized change to the flight control system, the violation of regulations. Mitchell listened without interrupting. When McKenna finished, Mitchell asked if he could do the same modification to Mitchell's aircraft. McKenna said yes, but Mitchell had to understand the risks. The modification was not approved, not tested beyond Hayes's single combat mission. If something went wrong, if the modification failed or caused some unforeseen problem, both of them would face charges. Court-martial, probably. Dishonorable discharge at minimum. Mitchell said he did not care. He had lost 4 pilots in his flight in the past month. All of them caught in turning fights they could not escape, dying because their aircraft could not respond fast enough. If there was something that could help them survive, he wanted it. Regulations could wait. Lives couldn't. That evening, after the day's missions were done and the aircraft were being prepared for the next day, McKenna modified Mitchell's P-38. Same piano wire tensioner, same installation method, same 8 minutes of careful work inside the boom. Mitchell flew it the next morning on a dawn patrol. Came back raving about the improvement, talking to anyone who would listen. He told his wingman the airplane rolled like a fighter instead of a truck, like someone had cut the weight in half. The wingman told McKenna he wanted the modification too, wanted it immediately, before his next mission. By August 20th, McKenna had modified 9 aircraft, working late into the night after his regular duty hours. His hands were constantly cut and bruised from working inside the booms. His thumb still had not healed properly from that first night, but he kept going. Word spread through the squadron like wildfire. Pilots started asking their crew chiefs if they had heard about the cable modification, this thing that McKenna was doing that made P-38 seconds roll faster. Some crew chiefs refused, said it was against regulations, unauthorized, dangerous. They were not wrong. It was all of those things. But other crew chiefs were willing to try, willing to break the rules if it meant saving their pilots. McKenna showed them how, teaching them the technique. Cut the piano wire to exactly 6 inches, bend it into a Z shape with precise angles, install it as an inline tensioner in the control cable system. Takes 8 minutes if you know what you are doing. Changes everything. The modification spread from pilot to pilot, mechanic to mechanic, aircraft to aircraft. No official documentation, no engineering approval, no paperwork trail that could incriminate anyone. Just whispered conversations in the ready room and the maintenance area. Just mechanics working alone at night, installing pieces of piano wire that officially didn't exist. Hayes shot down 2 more Zeros on August 22nd using the modified controls, bringing his total to 5 kills. Mitchell got 3 on August 25th. Other pilots started coming back from missions with kills, with stories of outmaneuvering Japanese fighters, of winning dogfights they should have lost. The statistics were impossible to ignore. Now, before we go further, I want to take a moment to talk about why this story matters today, because it is not just about World War II. It is about the difference between following procedures and solving problems. We live in a world that is drowning in regulations and protocols and official channels, and sometimes those things are important. Sometimes they protect us from making stupid mistakes. But sometimes the guy on the ground, the one doing the actual work, the one watching people die, sees a solution that the experts in their comfortable offices have missed. And when that happens, you have a choice. You can wait for permission, fill out the forms, go through channels, wait for someone with more authority to make a decision, or you can fix the problem. McKenna chose to fix the problem. And if you think that kind of initiative is worth celebrating, then hit that subscribe button right now, because we need more stories like this, more examples of people taking responsibility instead of passing the buck, more reminders that sometimes the best answer is not the official answer. Sometimes the rule book is wrong, and you have to have the courage to do what is right instead of what is authorized. Lieutenant James Watkins was a crew chief with the 49th Fighter Group stationed at Guadalcanal, about 50 miles inland from Dobodura. He heard about the modification from a pilot who had transferred from Dobodura to his unit. The pilot mentioned it casually, said that the P-38 seconds at Dobodura were rolling faster now, something about the mechanics fixing the control cables. Watkins was skeptical. He had been a mechanic for 12 years, military and civilian. The modification sounded too simple to make that much difference. Cable tension? That was basic maintenance, something you checked during every inspection. How could adjusting it change combat performance that dramatically? But he tried it on one aircraft anyway, mostly out of curiosity. The pilot came back from the next mission with his first kill after 8 weeks of combat, 8 weeks of frustration and near misses, and watching his friends die. The pilot said it was like flying a different airplane. Watkins modified 4 more aircraft that week. Other crew chiefs in the 49th saw the results and started doing it too. By early September, maybe 40 P-38 seconds in New Guinea had the modification scattered across multiple squadrons and air bases. The engineering officer at Dobodura noticed something was different in the combat reports. Pilots were reporting better control response, faster roll rates, improved maneuverability, but he could not figure out what had changed mechanically. Control cable tensions still checked out during inspections, always reading within specifications. What the engineering officer did not know was that the crew chiefs had figured out the inspection schedule. They were removing the tensioners before inspections, reinstalling them afterward. The pilots knew what was happening. The mechanics knew. Nobody told the officers. It was a conspiracy of silence, mechanics and pilots working together to keep the modification hidden from the brass. The kill ratio started shifting dramatically. In July, before the modification, American pilots in the Southwest Pacific were losing 2 P-38 seconds for every 0 destroyed. 2-to-1 loss ratio. Unsustainable. At that rate, the 5th Air Force would run out of pilots before the Japanese did. In August, as the modification started spreading, it was 1.3 to 1. Still losing more aircraft than they were destroying, but improving. By September, it was nearly even, almost 1 to 1. Something had changed, but officially, nobody knew what. Then the Japanese noticed. Japanese fighter pilots first reported the change in late August in their after-action reports and debriefings. Flight reports from the 11th Air Fleet, the primary Japanese air unit operating in New Guinea, mentioned that American P-38 seconds were maneuvering more aggressively than before, rolling faster into turns, reversing direction more quickly, responding more immediately to pilot inputs. The reports noted that tactics which had worked reliably for months were suddenly failing. Japanese pilots who had perfected their timing against P-38 seconds, who knew exactly how long it took a Lightning to roll, were finding their timing was now wrong. The Americans were responding faster than expected. Lieutenant Commander Saburo Sakai was one of Japan's top aces, one of the most skilled pilots in their entire naval air force. 64 confirmed kills. He had been fighting American pilots since Pearl Harbor, had shot down his first American aircraft in the opening days of the war. He knew how Americans fought, knew their strengths and weaknesses, knew how to exploit the characteristics of American aircraft. On September 3, 1943, Sakai engaged a P-38 over Wewak, leading a flight of 4 Zeros against a single Lightning that had gotten separated from its formation. Should have been an easy kill. 4-to-1 odds. Sakai used his standard tactic, the same maneuver he had used successfully dozens of times. Drew the American into a turning fight. Let the P-38 pilot think he had a chance. Waited for the P-38 to begin its roll, that predictable moment when the American committed to a direction. Then Sakai snapped his turn back the opposite direction, a hard reversal, knowing the P-38 would take too long to follow. He would get inside the American's turning radius, get on his 6, pump him full of 20mm cannon shells. Simple. Textbook. Except this P-38 reversed with him. Sakai had executed this maneuver dozens of times. He knew exactly how long it took a P-38 to roll, knew the timing down to the half second, knew it so well he could do it in his sleep. But this P-38 rolled faster than it should have, impossibly fast. Sakai barely avoided a head-on collision, both aircraft passing within feet of each other, close enough that Sakai could see the American pilot's face through the canopy. The American got guns on him, tracers passing just behind Sakai's cockpit. Sakai had to dive away at full throttle, breaking off the engagement, running from a lone P-38, humiliating. He returned to base confused and frustrated. Something was different about that P-38, something he couldn't see. The aircraft looked normal, standard markings, standard configuration, but it moved differently, responded differently. He reported it in his debrief, but his commanding officer didn't believe him at first. Sakai was too experienced to misjudge a P-38's capabilities, but Sakai insisted something had changed. Other experienced Japanese pilots reported similar encounters over the next few weeks. Pilots with dozens of kills, veterans of hundreds of combat missions. They all said the same thing. The Americans were not flying differently, not using new tactics or formations. They were still using the same boom and zoom approach, the same hit-and-run doctrine, but their aircraft were responding faster. Fractionally faster, maybe only a quarter-second difference, but enough to matter, enough to disrupt the timing that Japanese pilots had learned to exploit over 2 years of combat in the Pacific. Japanese intelligence tried to determine what had changed. They examined wreckage from downed P-38 seconds, looking for modifications or upgrades. Found no obvious changes. The aircraft looked identical to the ones they had been fighting for months. The engines were the same, Allison von 1000, 710 seconds. The armament was the same, 4 50 caliber machine guns and 1 20mm cannon. The airframe was unchanged. Nothing visible had been modified. The only difference intelligence could find was that some of the wreckage showed slightly higher cable tension in the control systems, but that was within normal variation. Could be explained by different maintenance practices at different air bases. What the Japanese did not know, could not know, was that the change was hidden inside the boom. A 6-inch piece of piano wire bent into a Z shape that looked like original equipment. Even if they had found it, even if they had pulled apart a control cable system and discovered the tensioner, they might not have understood its purpose or its significance. It was not a new weapon system, not a new engine, not some revolutionary technology, just a minor modification to control cable tension, a maintenance-level adjustment that shouldn't have made any tactical difference. But that minor modification was killing their pilots at an increasing rate. By mid-September, Japanese pilots were losing aircraft to P-38 seconds at rates they had not seen since early in the war. Back when they thought American pilots were easy prey, the psychological impact was significant, maybe more important than the actual loss ratio. For 2 years, since Pearl Harbor, 0 pilots had owned the sky in turning fights. They knew, absolutely knew, that they could outmaneuver anything the Americans flew. P-40 seconds, P-39 seconds, early model P-38 seconds. It did not matter. In a turning fight, the 0 won every time. Japanese pilot training emphasized this, built tactics around it. That confidence, that absolute certainty of superiority in dogfighting was breaking down. Pilots who used to press attacks aggressively were becoming cautious, hesitant, second-guessing themselves. They were not sure anymore if their tactics would work, if their timing was still accurate. Some Japanese pilots started refusing to engage P-38 seconds at all if they could avoid it. The Japanese tried to adapt, tried to develop new tactics. Some pilots stopped trying to get into turning fights with P-38 seconds altogether, used hit-and-run tactics instead, exactly the tactics Americans had been forced to use against Zeros. But that meant giving up their main advantage, the one thing that made the Zero superior. The Zero's strength was maneuverability, its ability to outturn any American fighter. Fighting like a P-38, using speed and altitude, meant fighting on American terms. And the P-38 was faster in a straight line, more heavily armed, and could take far more battle damage than the lightly built Zero. Other Japanese pilots tried to compensate by being more aggressive, more willing to take risks, closing to shorter range before firing, accepting more exposure to enemy guns, taking chances they would not have taken before. But aggression without the ability to reliably outturn the enemy just meant dying faster. Several experienced Japanese pilots were killed in September, trying tactics that had worked perfectly in July, dying because their timing was wrong, because the Americans were responding faster than expected. The fundamental problem for Japanese pilots was that they were fighting an enemy they could not see. They knew something had changed, could feel it in every engagement, could see it in the combat results. But they did not know what the change was, and they could not figure out how to counter it. You cannot develop tactics against a modification you do not know exists. You cannot compensate for a change you cannot measure or understand. By the end of September, the 11th Air Fleet had lost 38 fighters in combat, with P-38 seconds. American losses in the same period were 22 aircraft. The ratio had reversed completely. For the first time in the Pacific War, P-38 seconds were killing Zeros at a better than 1-to-1 rate. American pilots were surviving encounters they should have lost, winning dogfights they were not supposed to win. Japanese command issued new orders. Pilots were instructed to avoid engaging P-38 seconds unless they had a significant numerical advantage, at least 3-to-1 odds. That order marked a fundamental turning point in the air war. The Zero had gone from hunter to hunted. The aircraft that had dominated Pacific skies for 2 years was now being told to run away from American fighters, and it all came down to a piece of piano wire that nobody was supposed to install. The modification never became official during the war, at least not right away, at least not while it mattered most. The Army Air Force Engineering Command learned about it in October 1943 when a maintenance inspector at Dobodura, doing a routine audit, noticed inconsistent cable tension readings across different aircraft. Some P-38 seconds showed higher tension than others, outside the normal variance. He traced the discrepancies to the piano wire tensioners, found them during a detailed inspection of one aircraft, wrote a report, sent it up the chain of command to headquarters in Brisbane. The report sat on desks for 3 weeks while officers debated what to do about it. The situation was unprecedented, unauthorized. Modifications to military aircraft, installed by field mechanics without engineering approval, clear violation of regulations. But the modification was working. That was undeniable. Fighter squadrons using the modification had measurably better kill ratios, lower loss rates, higher pilot survival rates. The data was overwhelming. The question was not whether the modification helped. The evidence for that was crystal clear. The question was whether to punish the mechanics who had installed it without authorization, or quietly approve it after the fact and pretend it had been authorized all along. In November, Lockheed sent an engineering team to New Guinea to evaluate the modification, to determine if it was safe, if it should be officially adopted. The team spent 2 weeks testing, measured the cable tension, calculated the stress loads on the control system, ran flight tests with modified and unmodified aircraft, comparing performance. Their conclusion was that the modification was safe and effective. It improved control response without overstressing the cables or control surfaces. It should have been part of the original design all along. The engineers admitted, privately, that they had missed it during development. The slack in the cables was a design oversight, something that seemed acceptable on paper but caused real problems in combat. Lockheed integrated a similar tensioning system into the P-38J model that entered production in December 1943, making it a standard feature on new aircraft. But McKenna never received official credit for the modification. No commendation, no medal, no promotion, no mention in any official report or documentation. The official Lockheed documentation attributed the control system improvement to internal engineering analysis, made it sound like their engineers had discovered the problem independently. McKenna's name did not appear anywhere in the official record. As far as history was concerned, Lockheed engineers had fixed the problem. The field mechanic who actually solved it remained anonymous. Hayes survived the war. He flew 63 combat missions total, shot down 11 Japanese aircraft, earned 3 Distinguished Flying Crosses, and an Air Medal with multiple clusters. Returned to Iowa in 1945 after the war ended. Married his high school sweetheart, the girl he had been writing to for 3 years. Had 4 children, raised them on the same farm where he had grown up. Worked as a crop duster for 37 years, flying low and dangerous over Iowa cornfields, spraying pesticides. He never forgot what McKenna had done for him. Never forgot that McKenna had saved his life with a piece of piano wire and 8 minutes of unauthorized work. Every year on August 17th, the anniversary of his first kill, Hayes called McKenna on the phone to thank him. Every year for 43 years, until McKenna died. Mitchell also survived the war. He became a squadron commander, led his unit through the Philippines campaign, fought in some of the heaviest air battles of the Pacific War, shot down 16 aircraft total by the end of the war. After the war, he stayed in the Air Force, made it a career. Retired as a full colonel in 1963 after 25 years of service. He told the story of McKenna's modification to every young maintenance officer he supervised over those years. Made sure they understood the lesson, that sometimes the best solutions come from enlisted mechanics who see problems the engineers miss. That sometimes the guy with grease under his fingernails knows more about what works in combat than the guy with a college degree sitting in an office. McKenna stayed in the Army Air Force until 1946, until the demobilization after the war. Returned to California, went back to civilian life. Went back to working on cars, doing what he had done before the war. Opened his own garage in Long Beach in 1948. A small operation, just him and one assistant. He worked on engines. For 42 years, fixing cars for regular people who needed their vehicles to run. Never talked much about the war. When people asked what he did in the service, he would say he was a mechanic. Fixed airplanes, that was all. He never mentioned the modification, never told anyone outside his immediate family about the role he had played in changing the air war. In 1991, 48 years after the war, a military historian researching P-38 modifications found references to the piano wire tensioner in maintenance logs from New Guinea. Oblique references, nothing detailed, but enough to indicate something unusual had happened. The historian spent 6 months tracking down the story, interviewing surviving pilots and mechanics, piecing together what had happened. He tracked down McKenna through veteran registries, found him still living in Long Beach. McKenna was 73 years old by then, still working part-time in his garage, still fixing engines. The historian asked him about the modification. McKenna confirmed the story, told him everything, said it was not anything special, just something that needed doing, just a problem that needed solving. The historian estimated, based on survival rate improvements in squadrons that used the modification, that it may have saved between 80 and 100 American pilots' lives, maybe more. The exact number would never be known because there was no way to count the pilots who survived fights they would have lost, missions that succeeded because of faster control response. McKenna said he never counted, never tried to calculate it. He just remembered the pilots who came back alive: Hayes, Mitchell, Watkins, and the others whose names he could recall. That was enough for him. James McKenna died in 2006 at age 88 from complications of pneumonia. He was buried in Pacific View Memorial Park in California. A small ceremony, family, and a few old friends. His obituary in the Long Beach newspaper mentioned his service in World War II as an aircraft mechanic in the Pacific Theater. It did not mention the piano wire tensioner, did not mention that he had changed how American fighters flew, did not mention that he had broken regulations to save lives, did not mention that he may have saved 100 pilots through one unauthorized modification. His garage in Long Beach is still there on the same corner where he opened it in 1948. Different owner now, different name on the sign. But on the wall in the back office, there is still a faded photograph in a simple frame. A young mechanic in coveralls, standing next to a P-38 Lightning, hand resting on the wing. The date written on the back in fading ink is August 1943, New Guinea. Nobody knows who the mechanic is anymore. The current owner found the photograph when he bought the garage, thought it looked cool, kept it on the wall. That is how innovation actually happens in war. Not through official channels or engineering committees or proper procedures, through sergeants and mechanics who see problems, find solutions, and do not wait for permission to save lives. The brass will tell you to follow procedures, to wait for authorization, to respect the chain of command. The engineers will tell you everything is within specifications, that the tolerances are acceptable, that if there was really a problem they would have found it. The manual will tell you that delays and tolerances are normal, that the aircraft performs as designed. But the guy on the flight line knows better. Because he is the one signing off on aircraft that come back shot full of holes. He is the one watching pilots climb into machines that cannot respond fast enough to keep them alive. He is the one who has to look young pilots in the eye and send them off to die in aircraft that don't work right. And when that guy decides to do something about it, when he breaks regulations to save lives, when he installs an unauthorized modification because the alternative is watching another kid die for no good reason, that is not insubordination. That is leadership. That is taking responsibility when the people who are supposed to be responsible are sitting in offices 7,000 miles away, designing aircraft for theoretical combat conditions that do not exist in reality. That is exactly the kind of initiative that wins wars. If you appreciate this story, if you think it deserves to be remembered, then subscribe to this channel right now, because this is what we do here. We tell the stories that the official histories leave out. We remember the mechanics and the sergeants and the ordinary people who did extraordinary things not because they wanted recognition, but because they saw what needed to be done and they did it.